Then, welcome to today's seminar in this series. And it's the second seminar this week. This week we have a double session on cybersecurity of medical devices. And yesterday we had a very interesting overview and introduction to legal and ethical challenges around the cybersecurity of medical devices. And today we'll get an introduction into the security or the insecurity of implantable medical devices by my former colleague Eduard, who used to be in our research group at COSIC in KU Leuven for about 4 to 5 years. He did a PhD on the topic of the security or insecurity of implantable medical devices, with lots of really hand-on work. So I remember that in our lab, he was really handling defibrillators and insulin pumps and all these kind of things. So he has a lot of hands-on experience, and I'll leave the floor to him, and we'll see what he has to say. Thank you for joining us, Edu. The floor is yours.
Okay, so thanks for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. As Benedict said, I'll be speaking about the work I did during my PhD on the security, or better said, the insecurity of implantable medical devices. So today, there are many different types of medical devices that help patients who suffer from a broad range of diseases. So for example, we have insulin pumps, which are devices that are used to adjust the glucose level in people who suffer from diabetes. We also have pacemakers that are, we all know what a pacemaker is, but they are used to regulate the heartbeat of a patient when the heart goes slower or faster than expected. We also have neurostimulators. These are devices that are used to treat chronic pain or movement disorders such as Parkinson. And more recently, these devices have also been studied, or there are some studies that show that these devices can also be used to treat other diseases like severe depression. So these are just 3 examples of well-known medical devices. And actually, these are the devices that I studied during my PhD. One of the things that caught my attention when I started looking at the security of medical devices is that during the last few years, implantable medical devices have really evolved significantly, both externally and internally. Manufacturers have taken important steps towards reducing the size and the weight of these devices, and also increasing the lifetime of the devices, because you want the device to be implanted in the patient for a long time. And at the same time, interestingly, these devices have become more complex and interconnected. So now implantable medical devices have more software than ever, and they critically depend on this software to perform critical functions inside the body of the patient. Unfortunately, with all these advancements, implantable medical devices have also become more vulnerable to security attacks. But I think that here an important question is why would someone attack an implantable medical device, right? So there are different reasons. One possible reason would be to threaten, to bribe, or to hurt someone. There are several examples of attacks against patients in other similar scenarios. So for example, in 2007, a group of criminals managed to hack a website that was intended for people who had epilepsy. And what they did is they uploaded animated images with flashing colors in an attempt to induce seizures to the patients. This is just one example that shows that adversaries can try to hurt patients in various ways. And regarding implantable medical devices, there are no known attacks against real patients to date that we know of. It's true that this type of attacks could have happened without us knowing because they are very difficult to detect in practice. I mean, no one checks if a pacemaker stopped working because it was malfunctioning or because someone really attacked it. So people, I mean, I would say that lots of people would think that these attacks are unlikely to happen in practice because probably there are easier ways to kill someone, I guess. But surprisingly, 10 years ago, or well, now it's more than 10 years ago, the former vice president of the US already feared that someone could assassinate him through his pacemaker. So he asked his doctor to disable the wireless interface of his pacemaker. But besides this reason, there are also, so another possible reason would be to influence the stock market or to discourage patients from using certain devices. And actually, in 2016, a team of security researchers allegedly investigated the security of different cardiac devices from St. Jude Medical, which is now Abbott. Their study revealed that these devices had serious security weaknesses, but instead of notifying their findings to St. Jude Medical, they decided to release a report jointly with the investment firm Muddy Waters. So apparently, it turned out that Muddy Waters and the researchers had a sort of financial agreement to profit from a fall in St. Jude's stock price. And actually, they were quite successful in this because the St. Jude shares fell 10% in the stock market, as you can see in the graph. In addition to this, since implantable medical devices collect and transmit highly sensitive patient information, another possible reason to attack a patient would be to compromise her privacy. It's clear that this kind of data can be abused in lots of different ways. So one possible way to abuse or to abuse this data would be to infer which places a patient has visited or learn her movement patterns. So to understand how one could attack an implantable medical device, I think it's important to first understand the overall system architecture. So now I want to go through it a little. It's important to keep in mind that implantable medical devices can communicate with the outside world in two different ways, through their wireless interface and through their analog interface. The wireless interface enables them to communicate with external devices that are managed by doctors and are known as device programmers. Through a device programmer, the doctor can send lots of different commands to the implantable medical devices to reprogram its settings without needing to perform invasive surgeries to the patients. I mean, this is really convenient because you can also get more personalized treatments and you can do all these things without needing to undertake surgeries, which obviously have a risk of complications. And implantable medical devices can also send telemetry data to the device programmer to report the data that is being gathered by the medical device. In some cases, patients are also given base stations for collecting data from their implantable medical devices and sending this data to the hospital when they are at home. So these base stations are typically installed next to the patient's bed, and they collect information from the patient's medical device maybe once or twice a day. And this allows doctors to remotely monitor the patient's health when the patient is at home. Doctors, and often, I mean, in some cases also patients, can then sometimes access a web portal to review the telemetry data that was collected by the base station. Typically, both the device programmers and the base stations have an internet connection that allows also the manufacturer to update the software of the devices remotely. And then another type of device that can also interact with implantable medical devices are sensors. And these sensors, some of these sensors can be worn by the patients. And the sensors, what they do is they measure several physiological signals of the patients, and then they send this information to the implantable medical device. Obviously, the implantable medical device also has several internal sensors which are used to constantly measure these physiological signals in the body, and that enable to detect abnormal situations and actuate accordingly. So, for example, if you think about a pacemaker, all these sensors allow the pacemaker to know when the pacemaker should deliver a shock to the patient because the heart is not working well. So having explained this, it's clear that there are two ways how to attack an implantable medical device. One, and basically what the adversary can do is to exploit the two entry points. So one of them is through the wireless interface, and the other one is through the analog interface. In my work, I focused on wireless attacks only, because I think that at the moment, these type of attacks entail a bigger risk than analog attacks. If someone is interested in knowing some papers that have investigated analog attacks against medical devices, we can speak later about this. In the rest of the talk, I will focus on the wireless interface. And so now, in a very simplified way, I will try to explain which kind of attacks you can perform by exploiting the wireless interface of these devices. So one thing that you could do is, obviously the device programmer sends some messages wirelessly to the implantable medical device, and what the attacker can do is intercept these messages and infer some medical or personal data about the patient to compromise her privacy, right? This is a privacy attack. Okay. Another thing that the adversaries could do would be to replay messages that were previously sent by legitimate device programmers, or create their own messages and send them to the implantable medical device. If the adversaries succeed in sending valid messages to the implantable medical device, they could, for example, deliver an electrical shock to the patient's heart, or give a high insulin dose to a patient. So these kind of things. And obviously, these attacks can have devastating consequences for the patient, because they can potentially kill the patient or hurt them a lot. Okay. Another would be for the patients to repeatedly send messages to the implantable medical device to drain the device battery faster. So these devices have a limited battery. If you keep sending packets, eventually you can reduce the lifetime of the device, and this could also be seen as an attack. Also, because this kind of attacks, while they seem simple, they are very difficult to defend against, because all devices always need to perform some computations to verify if the messages that they receive are valid and should be accepted, right? So during the last decade, there has been quite a lot of work in this area, and we've seen several examples of wireless attacks against medical devices in the research community. That's why I call this like academic attacks. So there is, as I said before, there is no real attack in the wild that we know of. During my PhD, I analyzed the security of medical devices, and I proposed solutions to mitigate these attacks. You can check my PhD dissertation if you want an overview of the attacks and defenses that we and other people proposed. And now I will go more into the details of our pacemaker study, and I will explain you a little bit what we did. So this is the paper that was written with my supervisor Dave, who is probably in the call as well. So first, I want to set up a little bit the scene here. So back in 2012-13, we managed to establish a collaboration with a cardiologist in one of the hospitals in Leuven, and we were able to borrow some devices from the hospital. So I took the devices to the office, and we started playing with them to see, initially how the devices communicate with each other, and how. So basically, how a doctor would reprogram the device of the patient using the device programmer. So typically this is done in two phases. First, there is an activation phase where the device programmer activates the wireless interface of the pacemaker. And typically this is done by placing the device programming head on top of the patient's chest where the pacemaker is implanted. So by placing the programming head on top of the patient's chest, there are some messages that are exchanged between the device programmer and the pacemaker. And at the end of this phase, the wireless interface of the pacemaker is active. Okay, so it's important to know that this happens over a short-range communication channel. The programming head needs to be really, really close to the pacemaker for this to happen. And then once the device has been activated, the device programmer and the pacemaker typically communicate over a longer communication range, which is typically 2 to 5 meters. Now in modern implantable medical devices, they use Bluetooth low energy, and typically it's even more than this. But in the ones that I investigated, they were communicating on a specific frequency band, where typically the distance from which you can communicate is 2 to 5 meters. Okay, so that's how they work. And then during the long-range communication channel, the doctor can reprogram the pacemaker as much as he wants to change the settings of the device wirelessly. Okay. Now, one thing that is very important to understand here is that in the vast majority of wireless protocols, and this is how it should be, the protocol specifications are publicly available and can be found very easily. So think about Bluetooth, for example. Every time that you send a picture to a friend using Bluetooth, you follow a certain protocol. So there is a way for the devices to interact with each other that has been specified and has been defined, and anyone can access this information online. So you can know which kind of at which frequency they communicate, what is how all the bits are sent from one side to the other, which kind of security mechanisms Bluetooth uses, and so on. The problem here is that in these two protocols, in the short-range protocol and the long-range protocol, they are not documented, so no one knows how they work, and actually no one knows if security mechanisms are used or which security mechanisms are used. So this means that when we started this study, we got the devices and we did not even know at which frequency these devices communicate with each other. So this was a little bit our starting point. We got the devices, we knew that they communicate with each other at some frequency. We even need to find this. So the goal of our work was to find the protocol specifications and to understand, to be able to understand if there is any security mechanism. And something that is here also very important, and especially for the people who are not used to these terms, is to understand that in the security community, there has been quite a lot of effort on trying to understand previously unknown protocols. So this process is known as reverse engineering. So lots of times manufacturers have designed protocols that they kept secret, and lots of researchers have tried to understand which kind of protocol this is and which kind of security is being used. And this is done through a process that is called reverse engineering. Okay, so this is the lab setup that we had, and I would like to briefly explain it before going more into the details. Our lab setup consisted of device programmers and implantable medical devices, which are not shown in the image. We also use commercial software-defined radios. So these are these two devices, and these devices allow you to intercept the messages that are exchanged between the devices wirelessly. So we can connect an antenna here, we plug them into a computer, and we can capture messages that are sent at different frequencies. And we can also use these devices to transmit our own messages. So basically, these devices can be seen as the device programmers that we're using. Once we have the intelligence of the device programmer, we can use these devices to create our own messages. We also needed some antennas, obviously, some of which we made ourselves. I mean, you can see that this is very handmade, I would say. And then finally, obviously, we also needed a commercial laptop with a program. In this case, we used LabVIEW to control and interact with the software-defined radios here. And something that I would like to stress here is that all these devices are relatively cheap. And this is important because this makes this kind of attacks affordable to adversaries that have a low budget. So the first step in our work was to identify how the devices communicate with each other. So here I placed lots of information. What I want to stress here is what I said before. We didn't know at which frequency and how the information is exchanged between the devices. So we first had to know this, and we followed this process of reverse engineering to try to understand how this is done. I don't want to give a lot of details here because, yeah, for the technical people, I have already explained this. And now I want to explain a little bit the security analysis because I think that this is more interesting for the discussion that we're having today. So as I said before, one of our goals was to analyze the security of the wireless communication protocols between the device programmer and the different types of implantable medical devices. Now I'm focusing on the pacemaker case. And here the challenge, which I already mentioned a little bit before, is that the protocol specifications are not public. And this is because, in general, this is something that has been used quite a lot by implantable medical devices manufacturers to provide security. So basically, they keep the protocol specifications secret as their only means to provide security. In our community, this is known as security through obscurity, and it's a practice that should not be used. And later you will understand why. And here the problem is that we know very well that all these proprietary protocols can be reverse engineered, but implantable medical devices companies seem to forget or to ignore this. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to reverse engineer these protocols that I showed before. And reverse engineering means finding the message format and the protocol state machine. So basically how the devices exchange their messages with each other without having any prior information on the specifications. There are different ways how this can be done. So for example, you could go to one of the devices, you could extract the firmware and analyze it. But this approach would require to have physical access to the devices. And it's often invasive because it needs to, it requires to break or damage the devices. We opted to follow a different approach, which is more a black box approach, I would say, that I will now explain. And it consists of the following. We take the device programmer, and the device programmer is a sort of computer. So you can imagine this as a sort of dedicated computer that the doctor has in the office, in his office, and it's only used for reprogramming the pacemakers of her patients. And the idea is that, well, we had one of these device programmers in the lab, and we also had some devices. So we could perform different, so we could pair these two devices together. We could establish a communication with the pacemaker, and we could change some of the settings of the pacemaker ourselves. So what we wanted to do here is to use the device programmer as a sort of oracle. So yeah, we can do anything in the programmer, and then this will result in some changes being made in the pacemaker. Okay, so I will now go a little bit more into the details of how this works. So as I said, we want to see the device programmer as a sort of oracle. Okay, so in our black box approach, we want to give inputs to the device programmer. Say we change the therapy to X, being X, I don't know, change the speed at which some shock is given or so. Whatever. It doesn't really matter. We can just abstract this for now. But the idea is that we want to change the therapy of the pacemaker through the device programmer, and we want to observe the outputs that the device programmer produces. So this is information, these are bits, and this means that when we perform this function, the programmer sends this information to the pacemaker, okay? So what we wanted to do is, yeah, as I said, we want to perform an action on the device programmer, and then we want to observe the messages transmitted wirelessly as a result of this operation. And then by slightly changing the input, so now say that we reprogram the therapy to Z, and we perform differential analysis, we can identify where the changes occur inside the messages, and we can learn the fields that are included in the message. So you see that now we made a small change in the input, and this resulted in a small change in the output, which is the last bit. Okay, so by following this approach, we were able to infer how the protocol works, and then we did lots of different operations, and we managed to reverse engineer the protocol. Okay, and we saw that there is no security being used. I mean, there's a very I would say weak security mechanism that eventually we also understood and we could reverse, because it was not based on any key. But I mean, I think that in today's discussion we can ignore this detail. The main message that I want to give today here is that once the protocol is known, most of the times these proprietary protocols have no security or have very limited security. So once you know the message fields, it's very easy to craft your own messages and send them to the pacemaker to change the therapy yourself. Okay, so after we found this, we decided to notify the company affected, which in this case was Medtronic, following the principle of responsible disclosure, which basically implies that, I mean, obviously we wanted to write a paper about this, but what we decided and what we agreed with the company is that we were going to omit some important details in the paper so that no one could know that this is a Medtronic device, and no one could replicate these attacks in real patients. And then a couple of months after we got the paper accepted, and surprisingly, in 2019, 3 years after, the FDA issued a safety communication, which basically allowed everyone to know that these devices were insecure. We also learned that, I mean, initially we claimed that that our findings affected, I think, 12 or 13 devices from the same company. Well, apparently it was more. It was close to 20. I think it was 19 or 18. But we didn't have access to these devices, and we could not perform the experiments in all of them. And then also in this report, I mean, together with this report, we also learned that 2 CVEs were assigned to our findings. CVEs is a sort of unique identifier that identifies vulnerabilities that have been reported by people doing research in this area. And all CVEs have a sort of score that determines a little bit the severity of the attack. And one of them was actually quite high. I mean, the scale is from 0 to 10, so this one was quite high. So now I would like to sort of step back and try to understand the reasons why these devices are insecure. And I think that essentially this is because of several common security misconceptions of these implantable medical devices manufacturer when they design their medical devices. So I think that what they tend to follow is an approach that they think that security by obscurity is sufficient, that the hackers or that the adversaries cannot extend the communication range, that they need expensive hardware devices and big antennas. This is something that I've been told quite a few times. And that they also need to be very close to the patient to activate the pacemaker. But actually, I think that all of them are clearly not true. Researchers have demonstrated that these protocols can be reverse engineered relatively easily. And once this is done, they can be broken easily. Researchers have also demonstrated that the communication range can be extended by using more powerful devices that transmit more power, or by using more directive antennas. And also, we've seen examples of people who has miniaturized these hardware devices, showing that it's possible to carry some of these devices in your backpack, and I mean completely go unnoticed. There is also some research, and actually we had some people in the ESSEC building doing this kind of research, showing that it's possible to design small antennas that can be attached to people's clothes, which makes it, I mean, quite ideal for this kind of situation, because you can hide them very easily and they are quite accurate. And finally, in our study, we also showed that the short-range activation step, which is often seen as a sort of security feature, can be bypassed completely. So we don't need to activate the device to be able to send messages on the long-range channel, which I think that shows that these attacks are more feasible to mount. But now I also want to go more to the root of the problem. So the root of the problem is that these implantable medical devices companies follow a threat model that isn't realistic. So typically, when designing a security solution, you first need to define your threat model, which is basically, I mean, it defines, or it tries to specify the capabilities and who your adversary is. And this is a fundamental process. So it's crucial to understand very well the threat model when designing your security solutions. And the problem is that manufacturers often determine their threat model keeping some of the previous misconceptions in mind. And then, yeah, you start designing security systems that are completely insecure because the threat models are very unrealistic and undermine a little bit the capabilities that real adversaries have. So what can we do about it? Well, the solution is completely the opposite to what they do. So security through obscurity should never be used. What we should use is cryptography, and this is the only way to solve or to secure the wireless communication between the devices. And interestingly, cryptography is based on a completely opposite idea than security through obscurity. So in cryptography, there is something called as the Kirchhoff's principle, which means basically that everything in your system should be known to the adversary. So your system should be secure, even if the adversary knows the algorithm that you're using. All the things that you're using should be known to the adversary, except for the key. So the only thing that you need to keep secret for a system to be secure is the key. The rest of the things you can easily tell to the adversary, and this should not provide any advantage to the adversary. So yeah, as I said, the way to solve these problems is to use cryptography, but in this setting, it's quite difficult and quite challenging, because you don't care only about security, but you also care about other requirements that are equally important or even more important than security, such as availability, usability, and safety. In our studies, so during my PhD, we had some papers and some studies showing that it's possible to implement some types of lightweight cryptographic algorithms in medical devices, and we also studied novel ways how to establish keys between the devices. So we also wanted to show that despite being difficult to use cryptography in this setting, if you put a little bit of thought on it, you can design security solutions. Okay, so, and yeah, with this I will conclude my presentation. The main messages that I want to give today is that security means using strong cryptographic algorithms that are based on hard mathematical problems, and something that is not using a cryptographic algorithm, something like security by obscurity, using the distance as a sort of security mechanism, or saying that the activation step can provide some security, and only relying on these things to provide security is completely insecure. Yeah, and then I want to give this message that, I mean, we don't know if some real attacks have happened so far. I mean, perhaps yes, perhaps not, but regardless of the answer to this question, I think that it's clear that security is needed now. And with this, I conclude my presentation. Thank you a lot. I'll take any questions that you may have.